Hi class, this is Dr. McGonigal with another lecture for your Research Methods 2 class. Today we are going to talk about writing hypotheses, and we're going to apply this to your paper number 1. You must have 2 hypotheses in your paper number 1. So to get to 2 hypotheses, you will need 3 variables. For instance, 1 predictor and 2 outcome variables, or 2 predictor variables and 1 outcome variable. You can also have independent variables and dependent variables and propose an experimental design in your paper number 1 if you choose. What is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is a statement that proposes a particular research outcome. A hypothesis is grounded in theory and related to previous research, if it exists. So in some cases, there may not be any research on a particular topic, and in that case, you can ground your hypothesis in theory. Now, I should say that a lot of times, students might think that there is no research in their particular area, but there might be research in a related area. So if you're interested, for instance, in studying eating disorders in college students, and you're unable to find a lot of information on that, you might find research on eating disorders in other populations, like just general populations. So maybe in that case, you can draw on that to combine with theory in order to propose your hypotheses. A hypothesis is specific. It's also directional. So in terms of being specific, it's not good to have very general, vague statements in a hypothesis. In terms of directionality, you need to make sure that you're proposing what you think will happen in terms of levels of a variable. If you're proposing that one group has a higher level than another group, one group has a lower level than another group, or the direction of the relationship. So remember, when we went over our methods review, we talked about correlations can be positive or negative. So similarly, you can think about the relationship between 2 variables being positive or negative. Let's talk about some examples. This first one under examples is not a good hypothesis. So it states that year in college is related to psychological distress due to campus COVID-19 restrictions. So why is that not a good hypothesis? It is pretty specific, right? Because we're talking about psychological distress and specifically campus COVID-19 restrictions. However, it's not directional. We're simply saying that it is related to psychological distress. It's also not specific enough in terms of year in college. So it's not enough to say year in college. We have to talk about what year we actually mean. So let's look at a revised hypothesis that is more specific and directional. The hypothesis is that college freshmen experience greater psychological distress due to campus COVID-19 restrictions than college sophomores and college juniors. So we're being very specific about year in college, and we're talking about the direction. Freshmen will experience greater distress than those who are sophomores and juniors. Let's go through another example. Conscientiousness relates to performance. Now, this has problems with being specific and also not being directional. A revised hypothesis would be conscientiousness positively relates to job performance. So we want to be specific about what type of performance we're interested in. If we just say performance, it could be sports performance, it could be dance performance, but we want to make sure that we're talking about job performance. And we need the word positively in there to state the direction of the relationship. Because we wouldn't necessarily say that conscientiousness would negatively relate to job performance. We know that the research and the theory that's out there specifically says that it would be positively related to job performance. In other words, higher levels of conscientiousness relate to higher levels of job performance. In terms of applying theory to develop your hypotheses, step 1 is to generate a good research question. We've already talked about how to do that, and as a reminder, you can see your textbook chapter on generating good research questions as well, and the lecture video on choosing a research topic. After you've generated a good research question, you want to find a theory that helps explain an answer to your research question. So how do you find theories? The first thing you can try is looking at psychology textbooks. You can think about current and former classes that you've had, look back at your Canvas materials if you have them, think about what theories you have covered in that class and do they apply to your specific variable. Your knowledge of psychology as a psychology major. So you've taken a lot of classes in psychology up to this point, so think about classwork that you've done and your knowledge of psychology. You can also look online to reputable websites. I will say that this can be a great source of information just to get some general ideas, but you do not want to cite websites in your class assignments. So you might search around to find a theory that relates to a particular behavior you're interested in explaining, a particular thought pattern, maybe a psychological disorder that you're interested in looking at. You can get some general ideas from that, and then you can type those ideas into PsycInfo to get your research articles that you will then read and cite in your paper number 1 and paper number 2. The last is research articles. So this is probably the best source. Look at the articles that you found in your literature review. What theory or theories do the researchers draw on from these articles? And sometimes I should say that the researchers might not say that this is the theory of blah, 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 or this is the theory of blah, blah, blah. But they might say that, they might propose a logic that relates to why they think that variable X relates to variable Y, or group 1 has a lower level of something than group 2. So look at the logic that they're using. And if they name a specific theory, then you might be able to use that one for your paper. But you need to think about whether or not it actually applies. You have a hypothesis assignment due, and in order to do that, you want to submit a document with your research question, a paragraph that explains how you are making the case for your hypotheses, including theory or building your argument from previous research, linking studies together logically. This is really important. So remember that we are doing deductive research in this class, which means that we are taking previous research findings and theory that exists in psychology, and we're using that to make the case for our hypotheses. So that's your paragraph there. Then you want to list your hypothesis 1 and your hypothesis 2. Then you want to list your predictor or independent variables and your outcome or dependent variables. So remember, for this assignment, you need 2 hypotheses and you need 3 variables. In terms of this assignment and hypothesis development in general, I will now go through some common mistakes that I've seen students make in the past and how to avoid them. Problem number 1 is confusing your participants with the independent variable or predictor. For example, perhaps you have a research question about what leads to excessive drinking in college students. We went through that example in our last video. What is the outcome variable in this example? So think about that for a moment. Well, if you said the outcome variable is excessive drinking, then you would be correct. Excessive drinking is what we are interested in explaining. Is college students a predictor variable in this case? Think about that for a moment. The answer is no. College students is not your predictor variable in this case, and this is a very common mistake that students are making. So college students is the sample or the population that you're interested in studying. But the predictor variables in this case are not identified yet, because our question is simply what leads to excessive drinking. So our predictor variables are the what. Think about now, what are some possible predictor variables for this research question? So I have listed some predictor variables in this next problem number 2, which is a mismatch between hypotheses and variables. So let's talk through what those predictor variables could be, and then we'll talk through the specific problem here. So the predictors could be number of friends who drink excessively, and self-efficacy for refusing drinks in social situations. Remember how we went over the theory of planned behavior in our last video and how these two things apply based on that theory. The number of friends, that has to do with social norms, and the self-efficacy for refusing drinks has to do with perceived behavioral control. Okay, so now let's talk about the mismatch between the hypotheses and variables here. With our hypothesis 1 is that number of friends who drink excessively will positively relate to alcohol consumption. Number 2 is that self-efficacy for refusing drinks in social situations will negatively relate to college students' alcohol consumption. And if you listed here that your predictor variables are college students and refusing drinks, that is not correct. So the actual predictors in this case would be number of friends who drink excessively and self-efficacy for refusing drinks in social situations. What is the outcome variable? Well, we went over it earlier. The outcome variable, again, is excessive drinking in college students. Or more specifically, excessive drinking. College students is our sample. Problem number 3, proposing the same hypothesis twice. So if you had listed this, something like this, on your assignment, it would be incorrect. So if you have hypothesis 1, college students who live on campus will consume more alcoholic drinks per week than college students who live off campus. And then you have hypothesis 2, college students who live off campus will consume fewer alcoholic drinks per week than college students who live on campus. What is wrong with these hypotheses? Think about that for a moment. So the problem is that you're basically saying the same thing twice. So they're the same thing. One is saying that if you live on campus, you'll drink more than those who live off. The second one saying if you live off, you'll drink less than those who live on. So you're saying the same thing twice. Your hypotheses need to be two different hypotheses, not just the same hypothesis reworded in the opposite way. What are the predictor variables in this case? Think about that for a moment. So the predictor variable is living either on campus or off campus. So living situation. What is the outcome variable? Think about that for a second. So the outcome variable is alcoholic drinks per week consumed. Problem number 4 is that the theory is not linked to the hypotheses. So for example, I state here that I am using a theory of planned behavior, which states that there are 3 main categories of variables that affect a person's intentions to act or behave in a certain way and their actual behaviors. First, the social norms around a certain behavior will influence people's propensity to do that behavior. Second, the theory of planned behavior also states that people's beliefs in their ability to control their behavior in a certain area will influence whether or not they actually do that behavior. Now, if I said hypothesis 1, the personality trait of openness to experience will positively relate to drinking behavior in college students, and hypothesis 2, the personality trait of neuroticism will positively relate to drinking behavior in college students, this would be incorrect. Why? So what do you think is wrong with that situation? Well, if you said that the actual hypotheses don't relate to the theory that I used, then you would be correct. So openness to experience and neuroticism are my 2 predictor variables, but they are not represented in the theory of planned behavior. Remember that the theory of planned behavior talks about social norms and beliefs in people's ability to control their behavior. That has nothing to do with openness to experience or neuroticism. So in this case, if you had written something like this, you would lose points. Hopefully you're getting the picture that all of your answers and all of your things about your paper number 1 should be consistent. So your research question should be tested by your specific hypotheses. Everything should be lined up. The variables should be specified in your hypotheses with no extraneous variables. So no variables should come out of nowhere. Like you should have explained specifically what your research question is, talked about your theory that lines up with the variables that you're proposing. The theory should be connected to your research question, and it should provide support specifically for your hypotheses as they are stated. So everything needs to flow together like it does in the example that I gave you in our last video. So go ahead and review that example in the last video if you can't remember it.